things like that. If they can get into a discussion group, just being heard, just being respected and listened to, and without anything, really being given to them, that still is a way of offering something of profound meaning to them that can help them be happier people, or again, less miserable at least. And I think Mill would applaud this way of thinking, because I ask you to try to apply his philosophy, and I think this is a really nice insight. So, being kind to people, listening to them, hanging out and respecting them, doesn't really look like you're doing a whole lot, but just ask yourself, or think back in your own experience, at those experiences when you were not respected, people didn't seem to care what you thought, you didn't feel like you were being valued. Those are deeply troubling experiences for human beings. I don't know that my dogs really care about things at that level, but we do. Someone asks about if you are in a situation where you're creating some happiness and some misery, would these cancel each other out? And this is the whole point of the calculation. You say, okay, what choices I have $100 here, and I realize I can help people in a few different ways. What should I do? Mill says you calculate it. If I give the money to this group, what will they do with it, and what will be the results? And you say, well, okay, I think they'll be happy in these ways, maybe for this long, with this much intensity, but I think it might also cause some problems over here. So you sort of take the positive and the negative and get a sense of how they relate to one another. You do the same thing for every choice you have, and then you say, I'm going to do the one that seems to promote or add up to the most happiness. So yeah, misery does cancel out happiness, but then you go with the choice that is the overall positive. Okay. Someone says that they think Mill's hedonism goes with Kant's universal rule, universal moral law. And I think they're somewhat similar. Let me just spend a minute showing you why they're different, because it's, your test is on Kant and Mill. So Kant says we should ask ourselves about our intentions, and then look at our intention and turn it into a universal law. So that is something like, if you're a doctor, in order to cure a horrible disease, that's your end, your goal, I'm going to inject my patients with that disease and study them, right, and learn about the disease so that I can find a cure for it. But my patients don't want to agree to that, so I'm going to lie to them and tell them I'm giving them vitamin shots. But it's for a good reason, right? I want to cure this horrible disease. I'm going to save millions of people's lives. Yeah, these people are going to suffer a little bit, but I'll take care of them. I'll make sure they don't really suffer that much. But in the meantime, I'll get a whole lot of data to be able to solve this, cure this disease. So you take that scenario, and you say, okay, I need to examine that. I'm going to examine the intention. The intention is, in order to cure this disease, I'm going to lie to my patients and inject them with the disease, use them as kind of guinea pigs, right? That's your intention. That's a short description of your intention. In order to cure a disease, I will use my patients unintentionally or unaware as medical subjects. Kant says you should evaluate that then, not in the specific circumstances, but as a more general law. Is that the kind of law you would want everyone to follow? So it'd be something like, in order to save people from a lot of suffering, in this case disease, but make it more general, in order to save a lot of people from suffering, I will use a small number of people without their consent as medical experiments, something like that. Kant thinks none of us would want to live in a society where that was a law, where we all had to act that way, because he thinks we would all recognize that it's a violation of people's wills. It's a manipulation of their wills to lie to them in that way. Okay, so that's Kant. It sounds a little bit like Mill, because Mill seems to say when you act, you should think about the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. Now, in that case, you might argue that Mill would say, go ahead and do the experiment, right? Now, I don't know that Mill necessarily would, because he's also going to say that things like telling the truth, things like trust, things like the respect for other people's wills are essential to human happiness. Again, they may not seem like it. It seems like not having a disease is essential. Health is essential, right? But he's going to say, no, if you actually live in a society where people don't respect each other, where they're willing to manipulate other people, very soon trust in that society is just going to break down, and no one will be able to do anything good. You won't be able to accomplish any big projects because no one's going to trust anyone. So in the long term, in the short term, you might save a lot of people from a disease, but in the long term, you've destroyed trust, and that will even have worse long-term consequences. I don't know if this is a great example, but what you need to understand on a very simple level is that Kant will examine what you might call the rationality of our intention. So when he treats it as a law, he's not looking at the consequences of that law. He's asking, is it a rational law? Is it a law that we would respect? Does it seem, you might say, does it seem fair? Mill will examine that question, but he will ask, will it eventually lead to more happiness or less happiness? And I've just laid out how he might even say, in this case, you shouldn't do that to your patients. Even if you can cure the disease, you might be dismantling some of the basic aspects of society like trust, which will have longer-term negative consequences. But this is how he will answer the question. What are the results? Are the results good in the long term, however long the effects are going to be? And that's how you evaluate the morality of your action. Kant says, no, it's not about the results. It's about something like the respectability, the rationality, the fairness of the law itself, and not merely whether it leads to people being happy or people liking it. Kant will then, as I've said in the videos, he's the father of human rights, and he will argue that the most important thing a society can do is to protect each person's human rights. And so we have Nazis who have the right to say vile things, and Kant's going to say you don't have to agree with them. Absolutely, you do not have to agree with them, but you cannot violate their rights, because that's the free will expressing itself in the world, and the free will is the source of all possible morality, so you have to let it be free, completely free. We have to protect people's religious points of view as expressions of free will. So I just wanted to make sure you have some sense of how Kant and Mill may look similar at certain points, but actually are agreeing for very different reasons. So Kant and Mill might both look at a situation and say, you know, this is what you should do. They might agree on what you should do, but every time they agree on what you should do, they're agreeing for different reasons. Right? Mill because it will lead to more happiness, and Kant because it protects people's rights, or it's expression of an intention that we would all respect if it was something we all embraced. All right, I took 40 minutes. I hope you learned from this. If you have more questions, you know, you can send them to me, of course. But I wanted to make sure I got this to you before the exam next week, because I think it will help